Hi everyone, my name is Shreyaa. I'm a sophomore at MIT. Today I'll be talking about my research related to using a semi-supervised adversarial training approach to improve the classification of X-ray diffraction patterns and how this relates to tackling data scarcity in materials research. I did this work in the Buonassisi group at the MIT Photovoltaic Research Lab. Just to give you a little bit of background about the problem I'm trying to solve and what X-ray diffraction it really is, it's a process where a beam of light is shined on a crystal surface and the pattern shows the intensity of the diffracted beam at different angles. An example of a pattern are the images on the left, where you have different XRD patterns of different crystals with different dimensionalities. And so an XRD pattern is really useful because it gives us a lot of information about the structure and identity of a crystal. This leads us to a classic machine learning problem because we can take an XRD pattern and try to classify it into different characteristics, like their space group or dimensionality. Currently, the machine learning classifier uses a combination of experimentally generated labeled data as well as synthetic computer-generated data. The classifier that I mentioned in the previous slide that classifies XRD patterns, also known as AutoXRD, which can be found on GitHub, performs well, but there are a few notable challenges. First, acquiring the experimental XRD data required to train it is extremely tiresome, costly, and labor-intensive because of the labeling process. We need labeled experimental data, which is really hard to come by. And this issue of a lack of large and labeled data set is not only relevant to material science, but also many different domains. And second, this labeled experimental data is key to the success of the classifier because the simulated or computer-generated data performs worse than the experimental data. And sometimes it can be detrimental to the training of the classifier. If you look at the graph on the right, you'll see that the blue line graph, which represents having more simulation data, is in fact has lower accuracies and performs worse than the orange and black line graph, which represents having less simulation data. And so therefore, there must be some feature in the experimental data that isn't being represented in the simulated data. And so the goal of my research was to explore ways that one could mimic experimental data using non-experimental data, and therefore improve the efficacy of non-experimental data in training different classifiers and machine learning algorithms. Ultimately, we don't want to have a reliance on experimental labeled data because it's not necessarily accessible. So now I'll talk a little bit about the first method that I used, which was exploring a generative adversarial network. The structure of this network is that it has two different models. One is a refiner model and one is the discriminator model. Essentially, a labeled simulated XRD pattern is passed into the refiner model, and what the refiner model tries to do is reintroduce experimental features into the data using unlabeled real images. And so it takes unlabeled experimental data and tries to put these features that it learns back into the simulated data. And the output of that is a refined XRD pattern. Then this refined XRD pattern is passed into the discriminator model where it is compared with other unlabeled experimental data points. And so the discriminator model tries to distinguish between these refined data and experimental data by making a binary classification. And whether it classifies it correctly or not, it updates both of the refiner and the discriminator model. The key advantage of this method is that we can train with unlabeled experimental data. So we no longer have this bottleneck of needing to label the experimental data we use. And the output is a refined XRD pattern that looks like an experimental XRD pattern because it is refined using unlabeled experimental data. The second method that I explored was using a Gaussian filter, which simply put just applies Gaussian noise uniformly everywhere on the curve. And so on the left here, you can see sort of what the effect of this Gaussian filter was on a simulated XRD pattern. What it does is, it widens the peaks and adds in some noise, which are features that we found consistent with other experimental XRD patterns. And you can also compare this to the effect of the refiner model that I described in the previous slide, which also sort of widens the base of the peak and adds a bit more noise everywhere along the curve. Now to look at some results from the different models and taking the output from the refiner model and the Gaussian filter, and using that to train the XRD pattern classifier, we got some accuracy values using fivefold cross validation. And as I mentioned, it was for the space group classification of XRD patterns. And so the first row is just solely using simulated data. The next two rows are using refiner model A and B, both of which use the generative adversarial network structure that I mentioned earlier, but with different hyperparameters. And the last row is using the Gaussian filter data. And so what you can see here is that all three proposed methods perform better than this baseline simulated data, with refiner model A performing significantly better, almost twice as much. And the accuracies get even higher as you include more data. As far as future work goes, I really think that this sort of setup has a lot of potential as far as generalizing, tackling data scarcity in other domains as well, not just materials research. And I think a huge goal of my project was finding ways to improve the data as well as the amount of data that we have access to. And as a result of this, we can accelerate the development of energy resources and technology. And I really think these methods are a step in the right direction. Thank you for listening. I really hope you enjoyed my presentation. Feel free to email me. Thank you.